The sun had beaten down on Devil's Creek Ranch for 37 years, and for the last 15 of those years, only one man had felt its scorching touch. Jake Morrison stood on his weathered porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the endless expanse of scrubland that stretched toward the mountains. His beard had grown wild and gray, his clothes patched and repatched, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who had forgotten how to expect company. The ranch had once been prosperous. Before the drought, before the cattle plague, before Sarah died in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her, before Jake's heart had turned to stone and his voice had grown hoarse from disuse. Now, the only sounds that broke the silence were the wind through the canyon walls and the occasional lowing of his few remaining cattle. Jake had built his fortress of solitude deliberately. He'd run off every neighbor, every traveling salesman, every well-meaning preacher who'd tried to breach his walls. The nearest town was a 3-day ride, and he made the journey only when absolutely necessary for supplies. The townsfolk whispered about the crazy hermit of Devil's Creek, but Jake preferred it that way. People brought pain, and he'd had enough pain for 10 lifetimes. His daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Check the cattle, mend fences, hunt for food, sit on the porch as darkness fell, nursing a bottle of whiskey and watching the stars. Sometimes, on particularly lonely nights, he'd catch himself talking to Sarah's grave marker behind the house, but he'd always catch himself and retreat into silence. The ranch buildings were slowly falling into disrepair. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges. Weeds grew through the floorboards of the bunkhouse. The well pump squeaked like a dying animal. Jake fixed only what was absolutely necessary to survive. Everything else could rot just like his heart had. But on this particular morning something felt different. The air carried a strange electricity, and his old Mustang, Dust, kept looking toward the eastern trail with pricked ears. Jake dismissed it as another one of those feelings that meant nothing. He'd learned not to trust hope. The knock came at sunset, sharp and deliberate against the wooden door. Jake froze, his hand halfway to his whiskey bottle. Nobody knocked on his door. Nobody came to Devil's Creek Ranch. The sound came again, more insistent this time, followed by voices speaking in what sounded like Apache. Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard Apache voices in 15 years, not since the tribes had been relocated to the reservation. He reached for his rifle, mind racing through possibilities. A war party. Impossible. The wars were over. His hand trembled as he approached the door. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking from disuse. "We seek shelter," came the reply in heavily accented English. "We are women. We mean no harm." Jake's confusion deepened. Apache women, alone, made no sense. He peered through the window and saw them in the fading light, 10 figures in traditional Apache dress, standing patiently by his door. They carried no weapons that he could see, but their presence felt otherworldly in the dying light. Against every instinct screaming at him to remain barricaded inside, Jake slowly opened the door. The woman who had spoken stepped forward. She was perhaps 40, with silver streaking her long black hair and eyes that held an ancient wisdom. Behind her stood 9 other women of various ages, from an elderly grandmother to a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. "I am Aiyana," the woman said, her English careful but clear. "We have traveled far. Our horses are tired and night comes. We ask for shelter, nothing more." Jake stared at them, his mind struggling to process this impossible situation. "The reservation is 50 miles north. Why are you here?" "We are not from the reservation," Aiyana replied simply. "We are from the old places, the hidden places. And we have come because you have been alone too long." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. How could she know? How could she possibly know about his isolation, his pain, his deliberately chosen solitude? "I don't take visitors," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The elderly woman stepped forward and spoke in Apache. Aiyana translated. "My grandmother Nayeli says your heart is sick with loneliness. She says the spirits have sent us to help heal it. Jake wanted to slam the door, to retreat to his familiar isolation. But something in the old woman's eyes, a kindness he hadn't seen in 15 years, made him hesitate. Behind them, he could see their horses, travel-worn and tired. The women carried only small bundles, and the young girl swayed with exhaustion. One night, he heard himself saying, "The barn is clean. You can sleep there." That night, Jake lay awake listening to the soft murmur of voices from the barn. For the first time in 15 years, there were other people on his land, other breathing souls sharing his isolated world. The sound was both terrifying and strangely comforting. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, and found the women already awake. They had built a small fire outside the barn and were preparing some kind of meal. The smell of cooking food, real food, not the simple fare he'd been living on, made his stomach growl. Aiyana approached him with a wooden bowl. "Rabbit stew," she said simply. "The young ones caught them last night." Jake accepted the bowl reluctantly. He hadn't shared a meal with another person since Sarah's death. The stew was delicious, seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize, and he found himself eating with more appetite than he'd had in years. "You said you came from the old places," Jake said, surprising himself by initiating conversation. "What old places?" "The hidden canyons. The sacred springs. The places where our people lived before the white men came, before the reservations." Aiyana's eyes grew distant. "We are the keepers of the old ways. We preserve what was, and we heal what is broken. And you think I'm broken. Are you not?" The simple question hung in the air between them. Jake wanted to deny it, to maintain his armor of indifference, but the words wouldn't come. He was broken, shattered, a man living but not alive. Throughout the day, the women moved about the ranch with quiet efficiency. Without being asked, they began small repairs. The youngest, who Aiyana introduced as Itzel, oiled the squeaky well pump. Two middle-aged women, Citlali and Xochitl, began mending the barn door. The elderly Nayeli sat in the shade, working on some kind of weaving while keeping watchful eyes on everyone. "You don't need to do this," Jake protested, but Aiyana just smiled. "We pay for our shelter with our work. It is our way." Jake watched them work, and for the first time in 15 years, his ranch began to feel alive again. The women sang softly as they worked, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to make the very air vibrate with life. He found himself drawn to their industry, their quiet competence, their genuine care for their surroundings. That evening, as they shared another meal, Jake found himself asking questions about their lives, their travels, their customs. The women answered patiently, sharing stories of the hidden places where they lived, the old traditions they preserved, the healing work they did. "You have medicine?" Jake asked. "Not medicine like the white doctors," Aiyana explained. "We heal hearts. We heal spirits. We heal the wounds that cannot be seen." As if summoned by her words, Nayeli approached Jake. She spoke in Apache, her gnarled hands gesturing toward his chest. Aiyana translated. "She says your heart is like a frozen stream. It needs the warmth of spring to flow again." Jake felt tears prick his eyes, the first tears he'd shed since Sarah's funeral. "Some streams are frozen too deep to thaw." "No stream is frozen forever," Aiyana said gently. "Spring always comes." The women stayed the next day and the next. Jake told himself he was just being polite, that he'd ask them to leave soon. But each morning brought new small miracles. The ranch came alive under their care. Flowers appeared in the garden where only weeds had grown. The well water tasted cleaner. Even his few remaining cattle seemed healthier, more content. More importantly, Jake found himself changing. He began to look forward to their morning conversations over breakfast. He discovered that Citlali had a wonderful sense of humor, that Xochitl was skilled with horses, that young Itzel had a beautiful singing voice. Each woman brought something unique to the ranch, and collectively they brought what Jake had forgotten existed: community. On the fourth day, Nayeli approached him with a small leather pouch. She spoke in Apache, her voice serious and ceremonial. Aiyana translated. She wants to perform a healing ceremony. She says the grief has poisoned your spirit, and it must be cleansed. Jake's first instinct was to refuse. He'd held on to his grief for 15 years. It was all he had left of Sarah. But looking into Nayeli's ancient eyes, he found himself nodding. That evening, the women built a sacred fire in the center of the ranch yard. They formed a circle around it, and Jake found himself seated between Aiyana and Nayeli. The old woman began to chant in Apache, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. Other women joined in, their voices creating a haunting harmony that seemed to reach into Jake's very soul. Nayeli opened her pouch and sprinkled herbs into the fire. The flames turned green and blue, and the smoke carried a scent that was both earthy and ethereal. Jake felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning around him. "Tell us about Sarah," Aiyana said softly. For the first time in 15 years, Jake spoke about his wife. He told them about their courtship, their dreams for the ranch, their plans for children. He told them about the day she died, about holding her hand as the life left her eyes, about burying her and their unborn son in the hard ground behind the house. As he spoke, the tears came freely. 15 years of suppressed grief poured out of him like water from a broken dam. The women listened without judgment, their presence a warm embrace around his pain. "She would not want you to live this way," Nayeli said through Aiyana's translation. "She would want you to honor her memory by living, not by dying slowly." Jake knew she was right. He'd been punishing himself for 15 years, as if his suffering could somehow honor Sarah's memory. But it hadn't honored anything. It had only created more death, more emptiness. The ceremony continued deep into the night. Jake felt something shifting inside him, as if a dam had burst and frozen water was finally flowing again. When the fire finally died down, he felt empty but cleansed, hollow but ready to be filled again. The women extended their stay, and Jake found himself hoping they would never leave. Under their care, the ranch transformed. The house received new curtains, sewn by Sochil from fabric they'd carried in their bundles. The garden bloomed with vegetables and herbs planted by Seat Lolly. Young Itzel taught Jake new songs, filling the silence that had oppressed him for so long. But it was his relationship with Aiyana that affected him most profoundly. She was intelligent, compassionate, and surprisingly funny when she allowed herself to be. She had been married once, she told him, but her husband had died in a hunting accident years before. She had chosen to join the keepers of the old ways rather than remarry, dedicating her life to healing and preservation. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Regret what?" "My choice to heal others. Your choice to remain alone." Aiyana considered this carefully. "I was not alone. I had my sisters, my mission, my purpose. But I think perhaps I was not complete. Just as you were not complete in your isolation." Jake felt a stirring in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that sometimes the spirits bring us exactly what we need when we need it. You needed healing. I needed." She paused, searching for the right words. "I needed to remember what it felt like to be truly seen by someone." Their courtship, if it could be called that, was unlike anything Jake had experienced. There was no rushing, no desperate passion. Instead, there was a slow, careful building of trust and understanding. They worked together during the day, their hands sometimes touching as they repaired fences or tended animals. They talked long into the evenings, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. The other women watched their growing closeness with approval. Nayeli, in particular, seemed pleased with the development. "She says it is as it should be," Aiyana translated after one of the elders' cryptic pronouncements. "She says the spirits brought us here for this purpose." Jake found himself believing in the spirits' plan. How else could he explain the transformation of his life? 3 weeks ago, he had been a bitter hermit, counting the days until death would release him from his self-imposed prison. Now he was a man reborn, surrounded by laughter and love, planning for a future he never thought he'd have. As the weeks passed, Jake knew he faced a choice. The women were travelers, keepers of the old ways who moved from place to place, healing and helping where they were needed. They couldn't stay at Devil's Creek Ranch forever, and he couldn't expect them to abandon their sacred mission for his sake. But the thought of returning to his old isolation was unbearable. He had tasted life again, felt the warmth of human connection, experienced the joy of community. He couldn't go back to his empty existence. The decision came to a head one morning when Aiyana approached him with a serious expression. "We must leave soon," she said quietly. "There are others who need our help." Jake's heart sank. He'd been expecting this moment, but it still hit him like a physical blow. "I understand. Do you?" Aiyana searched his face. "Jake, you have been healed. The poison is gone from your spirit. You can live again, love again, be part of the world again. But you must choose to do so. What if I choose to come with you?" Aiyana's eyes widened in surprise. "Come with us. But this is your home. Your ranch. Your life. This ranch was my life with Sarah. That life is over. Maybe it's time for a new life." They talked long into the night, exploring the possibilities. Jake could sell the ranch, or perhaps find someone to care for it in his absence. He could learn the ways of the keepers, contribute his skills to their mission. He could travel with them, helping to heal others as they had healed him. But as dawn approached, Jake realized he was thinking about the problem wrong. He wasn't choosing between his old life and a new one. He was choosing between death and life, between isolation and connection, between fear and love. "I want to come with you," he said finally. "Not because I'm running from this place, but because I'm running toward something better. Toward a life worth living." Aiyana smiled, and Jake saw tears in her eyes. "Then we will make room for one more keeper." The final weeks at Devil's Creek Ranch were a whirlwind of activity. Jake arranged for a neighboring rancher to buy his remaining cattle and lease the land. He packed only what he needed for the journey, leaving behind the accumulated detritus of his hermit years. The women helped him prepare, their efficiency and experience evident in every decision. But perhaps the most important moment came when Jake visited Sarah's grave for the last time. He knelt beside the simple wooden marker, his hand resting on the mound of earth where she lay. "I'm leaving, Sarah," he said quietly. "Not because I'm forgetting you, but because I'm finally ready to live again. You always said life was too precious to waste, and I've been wasting it for 15 years. I think you'd approve of Aiyana. She's strong like you were and kind, and she's helping me remember who I used to be." He stood and placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, flowers that Lolly had taught him to identify and gather. "I'll always love you, but I think I'm ready to love again too." The morning of their departure, Jake stood on his porch one last time, looking out over the land that had been his prison and his refuge. The ranch looked better than it had in years, thanks to the women's care. Someone else could make it prosperous again, could fill it with life and laughter. "Are you ready?" Aiyana asked, leading her horse to where Jake stood. Jake looked at the 10 women who had transformed his life, who had taken a broken hermit and made him whole again. Nayeli nodded approvingly from her place on her horse. Lolly and Xochitl smiled encouragingly. Young Itzel waved excitedly, thrilled to have a new member of their traveling family. "I'm ready," Jake said, and meant it. They rode east toward the rising sun, toward the hidden canyons and sacred springs, toward a life of purpose and healing. Jake Morrison, the lonely cowboy who had lived alone for 15 years, was alone no more. He was a keeper of the old ways, a healer of broken spirits, a man who had learned that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with a simple knock on the door. As they crested the hill that would take them away from Devil's Creek Ranch forever, Jake looked back one last time. The ranch buildings were already small in the distance, but he felt no sadness. He was not leaving his life behind. He was carrying it with him, transformed and renewed. The 10 Apache women who had knocked on his door had brought him the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that it's never too late to begin again, that healing is always possible, and that love in all its forms is the most powerful medicine of all. Years later, travelers through the Southwest would sometimes hear stories around campfires about a group of healers who moved through the hidden places of the desert. They said the group included an old cowboy who had learned the Apache ways, who could heal broken hearts and mend wounded spirits. They said he'd once been a hermit, alone and bitter, until 10 Apache women had knocked on his door and changed his life forever. Some claimed it was just a legend, a tale told to give hope to the lonely and the lost. But in the sacred canyons and hidden springs of the desert, where the old ways still lived and the spirits still moved, Jake Morrison and his chosen family continued their work. They healed the broken, comforted the grieving, and proved, one person at a time, that no one ever has to be alone forever. The lonely cowboy had found his tribe, and in doing so, had found himself.